Hello, this is Chris Wilhelm, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the Friday, February 6th issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Our first article today, Trump's migrant detention pipeline extends from Minnesota to El Paso. Immigrants apprehended in Minnesota are being sent to a gigantic West Texas detention center where lawyers and detainees say conditions are deplorable, then released in El Paso to find their way home. By Pooja Salhotra and Jasmine Ulloa. Judson P. was driving through his southern Minneapolis suburb to pick up his paycheck on January 22nd when federal agents grabbed him from his vehicle, shoved him onto the icy pavement, shackled his arms behind his back, and hauled him to an Immigration and Customs Enforcement facility in Minnesota. The next day, handcuffed, feverish, and injured, Judson, 36, a Haitian immigrant in the country legally, at least temporarily, landed in a desolate detention camp in the desert of West Texas, only to be released 6 days later to an El Paso migrant shelter with no money and no obvious way home. "I cry every day," he said on Friday as he sat in the shelter 2 days after his release. He spoke on condition that he be identified only by his first name and last initial for fear of retribution. He clutched his head in his hands and gazed at the ground. "It's a really bad situation right now." Judson, whose record only includes 2 misdemeanor traffic violations, ultimately returned to Minneapolis on Wednesday, thanks to a group of concerned Minnesotans who have begun pooling money to fund flights back from the newest front in the deportation wars battering the Twin Cities, this one more than 1,300 miles away. Even as President Trump's mass deportation drive continues in Minnesota, one part of the drama now extends to El Paso County, Texas, where many migrants apprehended in the Twin Cities are ending up. Federal officials say the detainees have been picked up as part of targeted operations against sex offenders, drug traffickers, and other undocumented criminals, and that they are being held in safe and secure environments. Polls suggest many Americans, especially Republicans, continue to support the president's aggressive immigration enforcement. But Minneapolis and El Paso reveal what those policies have meant in practice. El Paso County leaders, immigration lawyers, and advocacy groups say ICE officials are leaving people to languish in harsh conditions in hopes that they will choose to self-deport, even if some have temporary legal status or may be eligible for asylum. Those who successfully challenge their detention are often left stranded at shelters along the border and forced to find their way home. "It's a torture situation," said Melissa Lopez, the executive director of Estrella del Paso, a group that provides immigrants with legal services. It is not clear how many migrants have been sent to El Paso. Of 45 ICE flights out of Minnesota in January, 39 flew to Texas, 35 of them to El Paso, according to ICE Flight Monitor, a data project under the nonprofit group Human Rights First. Nicholas Palazzo, director of legal services for a legal service provider called Las Americas, estimated that 30 to 40% of inquiries his office received in recent weeks for detained individuals came from Minnesotans with loved ones in El Paso. He said the office received more than 60 requests for assistance last week. El Paso, a Texas border city, houses 2 detention facilities, and a third one sits about 20 miles north in neighboring New Mexico. The largest, Camp East Montana, was hastily constructed last year at Fort Bliss Army Base. Lawyers, immigrant advocates, and detainees themselves have raised concerns about inadequate medical care, food, and maltreatment by private security guards. 3 people have died in the facility since it opened in August. One man died on December 3rd of alcohol-related liver disease, an autopsy found. On December 8th, human rights groups urged ICE to stop detaining people there. Homeland Security officials said the deaths last month of a Nicaraguan man, Victor Manuel Diaz, 36, and a Cuban, Geraldo Lunas Campos, 55, were suicides. But the El Paso County Medical Examiner ruled Mr. Lunas Campos' death on January 3rd a homicide, and legal and medical documents suggest guards choked him. One witness, Ricardo Andrade, 29, said in an interview in Spanish that he saw two guards rush into Mr. Lunas Campos' holding room after he shouted that he needed his asthma medicine. Mr. Andrade, a detainee at the time, then heard what sounded like a scuffle, and Mr. Lunas Campos' feet kicking against the plastic walls as guards tried to handcuff him. "They are suffocating me. They are suffocating me," Mr. Andrade said he could hear Mr. Lunas Campos screaming. Mr. Andrade, a former Uber delivery driver from Venezuela who was detained in New York, spoke by phone from Capachula, Mexico, where he was deported. He said he still wakes up with nightmares over the incident. In a statement on January 21st, the Department of Homeland Security said ICE takes seriously the health and safety of all those detained in our custody. It added that ICE investigates all deaths in custody, and the investigation of Mr. Lunas Campos' death was still active. An autopsy report for Mr. Diaz, the Nicaraguan who was arrested in Minneapolis on January 6th, has not been released. "We want to know how my brother died so we can be at peace," Mr. Diaz's brother, Lenin Diaz, who resides in Nicaragua, said in Spanish on a phone call. Since he moved to Minnesota in February 2023, Judson had worked so many odd jobs that he lost count. He was an Uber driver, delivered dinners through DoorDash and Grubhub, washed dishes at the airport, and assembled cake boxes for a food company, sending money to Haiti for his 3-year-old daughter, her mother, and friends. "My mission is to take care of my family," he said. At the time of his arrest, Judson had the authority to work in the United States through the Temporary Protected Status Program, which provides deportation protections to people from some of the world's most troubled nations. "Federal agents smashed Judson's driver's side window anyway," he said. Now back in Minnesota, he fears he has become a financial burden as he wonders whether he can find work. The same conveyor belt from Minnesota brought Heidi Samantha Coral Loya, a Spanish Ecuadorian college student with no criminal record, to the Texas desert, just hours after she was detained January 14th as she drove to class in a northern Minneapolis suburb. She spent 8 days in Camp East Montana, where she said food, water, and shower access were scant, and toilets were splattered with blood, excrement, and urine. She was denied medication for a thyroid condition and said she suffered from stomach aches and headaches constantly. The guards taunted detainees and hurled racial insults, she said. Acima Global Services, the private contractor supplying security guards, did not return requests for comment. Other immigrants said they and other detainees fell ill because of the dust, bad food, lack of medication, and stress. Representative Veronica Escobar, a Democrat from El Paso, visited Camp East Montana 5 times and said that during her most recent, on January 29th, she met a woman who was 6 months pregnant and had lost 10 pounds, an elderly woman who had collapsed because of high blood pressure, and a woman who said she had HIV and had not received medication. All the women were wearing snow boots and winter attire, Ms. Escobar said, the same clothes that they had been arrested in 3 weeks earlier. Ms. Escobar said letters she sent to Kristi Noem, the Homeland Security Secretary, and to Todd Lyons, the ICE director, have gone unanswered. "It couldn't be more obvious that this administration doesn't care about human beings," Ms. Escobar said. The pipeline from the north has shelters and immigrant advocacy groups that had grappled with record levels of migrants during the Biden administration, struggling once again. Ruben Garcia, the executive director of the El Paso shelter Annunciation House, said his organization had received 183 migrants from ICE custody in January, 51 of them from Minnesota, and the vast majority released from Camp East Montana. He added that the detainees often have no idea where they are and show visible signs of distress. When Ms. Loya, 18, was released last month, she was left at another nearby shelter with an ankle monitor clasped to her leg. Her lawyer helped her mother bring Ms. Loya home on a plane the next day, but federal officials did not return her identification and immigration records, Ms. Loya and her mother said. She had been granted temporary legal status to live and work in the United States in 2023 when she applied for a visa for domestic abuse survivors, and she had presented officers with her identification, Social Security, and work authorization cards, but said they refused to recognize them. "Every time a car follows behind me too close, I feel fear," she said from her home in Minneapolis. "I am so afraid of getting stopped again." On Friday afternoon, an El Salvadorian, who asked to go by his nickname Nando for fear of repercussions, arrived at Annunciation House after spending about 3 weeks in Camp East Montana. He had been detained in St. Cloud, Minnesota on January 11th, even though he said he showed officers his Social Security card and driver's license and had work authorization that did not expire until March. He said he came to the United States in 2000 under temporary protected status and lived in New York and New Jersey before relocating to Minnesota with his girlfriend. After 6 days of not receiving his heart medication, he said he woke up in the middle of the night in his bunk at Camp East Montana, unable to breathe. A security guard escorted him to a medical area where he received his medicine, he said. Nando was told on his release to appear for check-in with ICE on February 23rd in St. Paul. Worried he did not have money to buy a plane ticket back home until he connected with the Minnesotans helping with airfare. Judson was brought back by that same group on Wednesday. He said he felt nervous to return to a place where federal agents had killed Renee Good and Alex Preddy, but he had come back to handle his affairs, a towed vehicle he had a loan on, an apartment he rented with his sister, and his belongings. He does not know what he will do next. If his protected status expires, he said he would return to Haiti and find work as a driver. He just needs time. "If they give me a chance," he said, "I can save money and then go back to my country." Trump strips job protections from thousands of federal workers. The policy change makes it easier for the president to discipline or remove up to 50,000 employees, another push in the administration's campaign to reshape the federal workforce. By Eileen Sullivan. The Trump administration finalized a new policy on Thursday that would strip job protections from up to 50,000 federal workers, a move that would make it easier for President Trump to remove or discipline them in his latest effort to dismantle the federal workforce. Until now, the roughly 4,000 people appointed by the president, known as political appointees, were the only federal workers who could be fired at will. The policy issued on Thursday allows the administration to expand that number to include career employees whom the administration considers to also have policy-related roles. For these employees, any whistleblower complaints would now be handled inside their agencies rather than by the Independent Office of Special Counsel, as they had previously. The 255-page rule did not say precisely which positions would be affected. The White House will ultimately make that decision. Scott Cooper, the director of the Office of Personnel Management, said on Thursday. The announcement represents another push in the administration's campaign to reshape the federal workforce, which has included mass firings, layoffs, pressured resignations, and early retirements. In total, about 352,000 employees left the federal government in 2025, according to the most recent data from the Personnel Agency. The new policy is also the latest step the administration has taken to replace nonpartisan civil servants with employees who are ideologically aligned with the president. The proposed version of the rule drew wide criticism, with more than 35,000 submissions over a 45-day public comment period last year. More than 90% of the commenters opposed the new policy, according to an analysis by the New York Times that used artificial intelligence tools to classify each comment's viewpoint. In a statement announcing the final rule, the Office of Personnel Management said that political patronage, loyalty tests, and political discrimination in the federal workforce were explicitly prohibited. The rule, which is expected to be published in the Federal Register on Friday, describes the new job category as career jobs filled on a nonpartisan basis, yet they will be at-will positions exempted from adverse action procedures or appeals. Mr. Cooper argued that the change helped restore accountability to the federal workforce by offering more control of the executive branch to a democratically elected official, the president. But critics question whether the government can be taken at its word after a year of retributive firings, including dismissal of several whistleblowers. The rule amounts to a huge increase of at-will employment with an administration that has demonstrated a contempt for nonpartisan expertise, said Max Stier, the chief executive of the Partnership for Public Service, a nonprofit group that promotes an effective federal workforce. Their track record does not justify trust, and our history as a country demonstrates that these kind of changes lead to worse government results, not better. The new rule, said Don Kettle, an emeritus professor at the University of Maryland who studies the civil service, sweeps away all the pillars of accountability except responsiveness to the president. He added, that, of course, is patronage under a different name. Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, called the new rule a good thing on Thursday. I think if people aren't doing their job, they aren't showing up for work. If they're not working hard on behalf of this president, they're not welcome to work for him at all, she said. Mr. Trump returned to the Oval Office squarely focused on the federal bureaucracy, convinced that it was populated by liberal civil servants who stood in the way of much of his agenda during his first term. We need to make it much easier to fire rogue bureaucrats who are deliberately undermining democracy, Mr. Trump said in July 2022. The long tradition of a nonpartisan civil service includes a deliberate division between career employees and political appointees. This is in part so career officials with deep expertise can offer context and information to policymakers without fear of getting fired. The career staff aren't there to subvert an agenda, said Spiro Stefanou, a former administrator of the Agriculture Department's Economic Research Service. We're not interested in the agenda, we're interested in your needs. Tell us what you need. In addition to the rule published on Thursday, Mr. Trump last year changed the federal job application process to include questions about some of his policies, which critics have described as a loyalty test. He established hiring committees to make decisions about who works for the federal government and to screen candidates for partisanship. He stripped union rights from nearly 500,000 employees. The moves have drawn 68 legal challenges as of Thursday, and 61 remain active. The new policy also changes the path for whistleblowers. Instead of going to an independent agency with a complaint, those federal employees would instead raise the issue with someone unbiased in the agency's general counsel's office who would investigate, the Office of Personnel Management said on Thursday. Tom Devine, the legal director at the Government Accountability Project, a nonprofit group that supports whistleblower protections, said the new policy turned the Whistleblower Protection Act, a law shielding federal employees from retribution, into a bad joke. His group filed a lawsuit against the administration over an executive order issued last year that called for the new policy. 2 unions representing federal employees are also suing the administration in an effort to halt the changes. Mr. Trump proposed a similar policy toward the end of his first administration, but it never got off the ground. Former President Joseph R. Biden Jr. then issued an order aimed at making it harder for Mr. Trump or a like-minded Republican to revive the initial policy. On his first day back in office, Mr. Trump issued an executive order revoking Mr. Biden's rule and setting up the change announced on Thursday. Protections for federal workers date back to the late 1880s, when Congress passed a law requiring the government to hire and fire people based on merit and not political loyalty. Over the years, these protections drew complaints from some administrations about the difficulty of replacing civil servants. Because of the maze of rules and regulations with regard to the hiring and firing of federal employees, the executive is more often than not frustrated with its ability to ensure a loyal chain of command. Fred Malek, an official in former President Richard M. Nixon's administration, wrote in a 1970s guide about federal personnel, including strategies to replace civil servants with politically aligned officials. After the Watergate scandal, Congress passed laws to strengthen civil service protections and improve accountability. The Trump administration has issued policies that appear to chip away at those protections. Soon after he returned to the Oval Office, Mr. Trump fired 8 inspectors general and the heads of 9 independent agencies and boards. Those fired included the head of the Merit Systems Protection Board and the head of the Office of Special Counsel, in effect cutting off the narrow paths that federal workers had to challenge their firings. And he directed the conversion of thousands of positions in the nonpartisan senior executive service into spots for at-will employees. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Congress nixes visas for Afghan partners, closing off a key path. President Trump froze a program to allow Afghans who had worked with American troops to come to the United States. Now Congress has quietly scrapped the visas, leaving little hope of reviving them. By Megan Miniero. Zia Ghafouri stood in the East Room of the White House in 2018, beaming as President Trump thanked him for his noble service as an interpreter for a team of Green Berets in Afghanistan at a ceremony honoring their bravery at the Battle of Shock Valley. But last year, Mr. Trump froze the special visa program that gave Mr. Ghafouri and other Afghans who worked with the American government over 2 decades of war with the Taliban a path to legal status in the United States. The president did so hours after an Afghan national who had fought in a paramilitary group linked to the CIA and entered the United States on a 2-year grant of parole in 2021 shot 2 National Guard members in Washington, D.C., one of them fatally. Then, on Tuesday, Congress quietly closed the door to the program altogether when it cleared a spending package that authorized no new visas for it. The wind-down of the program reflected a rapid political shift on Capitol Hill after the November shooting by Rahmanullah Lakhanwal, who did not have a special Afghan visa but had been granted asylum by the Trump administration. Many Republicans in Congress, even some who had backed the Afghan Partners program, quickly fell in line behind Mr. Trump as he vilified the same Afghan partners whom many of them had demanded the Biden administration make every effort to rescue when the United States withdrew from Kabul in 2021. The fear of backlash from a GOP base that for years has embraced Mr. Trump's xenophobic statements about migrants, including blanket assertions that Afghans are terrorists, a suggestion he amplified after the National Guard shooting, appears to have overpowered what had been a solid bipartisan consensus around the importance of standing behind Afghans who served alongside Americans during the war. Republican voters think that any Afghan that got into the United States is a terrorist, said Representative Michael McCaul of Texas, who was the top Republican on the Foreign Affairs Committee during the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and has announced his retirement from Congress. While he said he was all for more vetting of Afghans entering the country, Mr. McCaul said any person who qualified for a special immigrant visa would have worked closely with the U.S. personnel. So to say they are terrorists when they actually worked alongside our military and intelligence community to kill terrorists doesn't make any sense, Mr. McCaul said. Now, Afghans with pending applications have no sense of when or whether the Trump administration might resume issuing visas. That has left many of them who are still in Afghanistan or living as refugees in another country in jeopardy. These Afghan allies were the ones who stood with their sons and daughters overseas, Mr. Ghafouri said in a recent interview. They carried their wounded and they saved their lives. Authorizing more visas over the years had at times required backroom wrangling, but there was always a contingent of Republicans, many of them veterans, who demanded that Washington stand by its promise to bring Afghan partners safely to the United States. But in an election year, and with a president who is quick to endorse challengers to primary members of his own party who cross him, no Republican has called for Congress to provide special Afghan visas for another year or publicly opposed Mr. Trump's indefinite pause on the program. They said nothing to dispute the president's claims, made without evidence, that a breakdown in vetting led to the National Guard shooting. Still, there have been no proposals from the Trump administration or congressional Republicans to increase vetting of special Afghan visa applicants. They're just slamming the door shut, Senator Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire, the top Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee, said in a statement. Stranding vetted SIV applicants or sending Afghan families back into the hands of the Taliban isn't about security. It's a betrayal of the promises we made to those who risked their lives for the United States. Democrats said they had tried and failed to persuade Republicans who had supported the program in the past to include it in this year's spending package. There's a lot of veterans on the Republican side who would do it, said Representative Jason Crow of Colorado, a former Army Ranger who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. They unfortunately don't have the courage right now to vote publicly. The State Department told Congress last summer that there were around 9,000 special immigrant visas still available to issue to Afghans. But the Trump administration has given Congress no indication it plans to allocate those visas to tens of thousands of outstanding applicants. Last July, there were over 1,400 Afghans in the final stages of the vetting process, and over 100,000 more still submitting documents, including a recommendation from a top military or diplomatic official. In a statement, the State Department said the pause on the special visa program was to ensure proper vetting and to confirm the identities and visa eligibility of the applicants. The department would not say whether the remaining visas would ultimately be issued. A bipartisan group of lawmakers pushed last year for Congress to approve 20,000 more special visas for Afghans, writing in a letter to senior appropriators that applicants often take years to complete rigorous vetting. Some Republicans said after the shooting that they were still pushing to include more visas in the State Department spending bill. Representative Marionette Miller Meeks, an Iowa Republican who last year had endorsed including thousands of new visas, said it was now vastly more difficult. Republicans blame the Biden administration for leaving Afghan partners stranded in Afghanistan and evacuating others to a third country where they were told they would be processed and brought to the United States. Those who called for thousands more visas in the past said they have not forgotten those Afghans. I'm committed to finding a pathway forward to help our Afghan partners who put their lives on the line alongside U.S. service members while maintaining rigorous vetting and ensuring accountability at every step, said Representative Zach Nunn of Iowa, a Republican and combat veteran who flew missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. Legal experts said that while Mr. Trump cannot unilaterally end the program, it is unclear what, if any, levers Congress has to force his administration to issue the remaining visas to applicants, some of whom have already waited years and would be left with no other avenue to reach the United States if they did not receive them. Democrats, together with the handful of Republicans who continue to support the Afghan Partners Program, still hold out hope of reopening the door to applicants and authorizing new visas in a future spending bill if they win control of either chamber in the midterm elections. Mr. Crow warned that it would be a moral stain on the country if lawmakers failed to revive the program and turn our back on our partners from Afghanistan. Italy toughens protest laws hours before planned rallies at Winter Olympics. The restrictions could affect people demonstrating this weekend outside Olympic events in northern Italy. By Elisabetta Povoledo. The Italian government on Thursday issued a decree that tightened restrictions on protests the day before crowds were expected to demonstrate outside the opening ceremonies for the Winter Olympics in northern Italy. The decree allows the police to detain people for up to 12 hours when there are reasonable grounds to believe that they may jeopardize the peaceful conduct of a protest. The Interior Minister, Matteo Piantedosi, said at a press briefing on Thursday evening. Mr. Piantedosi said the decree would take effect within days, meaning that it could affect demonstrators who plan to gather on Friday and Saturday in northern Italy to protest the disruption caused by the Olympics and the deployment of ICE agents to Italy as part of the security team protecting the United States delegation. Government officials said the decree, which included 32 other measures, including tighter restrictions on knives, was intended to protect ordinary people and police officers from street violence and should not be seen as a restriction of freedom. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni said in a statement on social media that the measure would defend citizens and enable law enforcement agencies to work better and with greater protection. Critics called the decree an infringement of civil liberties, with Giuseppe Conte, an opposition leader, saying that its purpose was to suffocate dissent. Mr. Conte said on social media that the move fell short of ensuring safety on the streets and did nothing to increase the number of police officers. The decree came days after clashes between the police and protesters in Turin, northern Italy, stirred anger among the right-wing government's supporters, adding to pressure on the government to tighten rules on demonstrations. Thousands of people had gathered in Turin on Saturday to protest the recent eviction of a left-wing group from a center it had occupied for decades. The largely peaceful demonstration turned violent when a group of masked protesters threw firecrackers, and the police fired tear gas and charged the protesters. The video of a police officer being attacked by some demonstrators created widespread public outcry. Mr. Piantedosi said on Thursday that the government had been planning to tighten existing security measures even before the clashes in Turin. The decree takes effect as soon as it is published in the government's official gazette, but it loses legal effect if it fails to attract the support of most lawmakers within 60 days. Ms. Meloni's conservative government has focused on law and order since taking office in October 2022. A security decree passed in June 2025 created more than a dozen new crimes, including protest activity in prisons and migrant centers, and made some kinds of demonstrations punishable with up to 2 years in prison. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Ukraine-Russia talks end with little progress and hints of impasse. American negotiators trumpeted plans for a prisoner swap, but that was small recompense for months of diplomatic efforts by the Trump administration. By Kim Barker. After just 3 hours, Russia, Ukraine, and the United States declared themselves done with the latest round of peace talks on Thursday, offering scant sign of progress toward ending a war that is nearing a 5th year despite the Trump administration's diplomatic interventions. A familiar pattern played out as 2 days of negotiations wrapped up in Abu Dhabi, the capital of the United Arab Emirates. Everyone said the talks were productive. More talks were planned, yet with little to show for them but an announced exchange of prisoners of war. The major sticking points in any peace deal appeared a long ways from being unstuck. Officials did not say what was discussed behind closed doors. A louder message came a day before the talks, when Russia unleashed another huge attack on Ukraine's power grid during a frigid winter. The delegations in Abu Dhabi had been expected to focus on the 2 main obstacles to a peace deal: the fate of Ukrainian-controlled territory in the east and guarantees over Ukraine's post-war security. Kyrylo Budanov, the chief of staff for President Volodymyr Zelensky and a member of Ukraine's negotiating team, told a Ukrainian news outlet that the talks were really constructive. He spent more time praising the Emirates and the United States, however, for the high-quality organization and mediation. Steve Witkoff, President Trump's special envoy, tried to cast the results of the talks in a positive light, saying that Russia and Ukraine had agreed to swap 314 prisoners. But this represented no particular breakthrough in diplomatic efforts that have stretched on for months, long past Mr. Trump's campaign promise to end the war in 24 hours. Ukraine and Russia have regularly exchanged prisoners of war and the remains of the dead for years. This outcome was achieved from peace talks that have been detailed and productive, Mr. Witkoff said on social media. He added, while significant work remains, steps like this demonstrate that sustained diplomatic engagement is delivering tangible results and advancing efforts to end the war in Ukraine. Mr. Witkoff said the trilateral discussions, first held over 2 days last month, would continue with additional progress anticipated in the coming weeks. Within a few hours, Russia and Ukraine traded 157 prisoners, the first swap since early October. It was unclear if this exchange was related to the peace talks, as prisoner releases usually take days or even weeks to arrange. The U.S. European Command also announced that because of the talks, the U.S. Armed Forces would resume high-level military dialogue with Russia. Getting Moscow to budge on any of the major hurdles in the peace talks is a far more difficult challenge, analysts say. Russia believes it is winning on the battlefield and has no need to compromise, they say, despite its huge losses of troops and glacial territorial gains. Russia now controls about 20% of Ukraine territory. While the Russian army's progress has been slow, it picked up somewhat in the final months of last year. Publicly, the Kremlin has so far not stepped back from the aims it laid out when it launched its full-scale invasion almost 4 years ago. It wants all of an eastern area known as the Donbass, made up mostly of Donetsk and parts of 2 neighboring regions in Ukraine. Ukraine still holds on to about 20% of Donetsk. On Thursday, the Russian delegation in Abu Dhabi doubled down on this goal. The state-run news agency TASS said Russia did not just want Ukraine to surrender all of the Donbas as part of any deal. Negotiators, it reported, also insisted on the recognition of the Donbas as Russian territory by all other countries. Moscow also opposes any security guarantees for Ukraine that would mean Western soldiers in the country or membership in NATO. Ukraine has indicated that it would be willing to freeze the border along the line of contact on the battlefield, at least for now. It has accepted that it will not be allowed to join NATO, at least for now. But it has opposed the idea of trading away any territory it now holds. Accepting the idea that other nations would consider the Donbas anything other than Ukrainian is a non-starter, even if territory has to be ceded for now. The actions of Russia during the trilateral talks show that President Vladimir V. Putin has become adept at telling Mr. Trump what he wants to hear, tapping me along, as the American president has put it, while continuing to pursue the war in Ukraine. Negotiators from Russia, Ukraine, and the United States first met in Abu Dhabi on January 23rd and 24th for the initial round of talks, on the heels of Russian attacks that devastated Ukraine's power grid during the country's harshest winter in more than 10 years. Everyone described those talks as constructive afterward. Ukraine and the United States even reached a theoretical deal on American security guarantees, although there's no indication that Russia would agree to those. Last Thursday, Mr. Trump announced that he had won an agreement from Mr. Putin to stop hitting Ukraine's power infrastructure for a week because of the extreme cold. But on Friday, Mr. Putin's spokesman, Dmitry S. Peskov, clarified that the truce applied only to Kyiv, the capital, that it would end on Sunday, when the second round of trilateral negotiations was originally supposed to start, and that the reason Mr. Putin had agreed to Mr. Trump's request was to create favorable conditions for negotiations. On Saturday, Mr. Witkoff held a surprise meeting in Florida with Kirill Dmitriev, the Kremlin's special envoy and head of Russia's sovereign wealth fund. The Ukrainians were not at the table. As is typical, neither side released details of what was discussed. Mr. Witkoff said on social media that the meeting had been productive and constructive. While Russia stopped hitting Ukraine's power grid for several days, it continued to strike at the country's logistical hubs supporting the energy grid. The trilateral negotiations scheduled for Sunday were delayed several days, and then the truce, such as it was over. The favorable conditions for negotiations described by Mr. Peskov quickly evaporated. Early Tuesday, the day before the trilateral negotiations were set to begin, Russia again pummeled Ukraine's power plants, attacking them in at least 6 regions with 450 drones and 71 missiles. It was the most Russian missiles fired into Ukraine in a single night since Christmas 2024, according to Air Force statistics compiled by the New York Times. It was also a record number of ballistic missiles fired at the power grid, Mr. Zelensky said. Ukraine's military intelligence agency estimated that Russia had spent almost $325 million on drones and missiles for the attack. Mr. Zelensky said these strikes would change Ukraine's approach to the trilateral negotiations, although it is not clear how or if they did. After the attacks, Mr. Trump told reporters that he was satisfied that Mr. Putin had kept his word on the energy truce. But others were not, including Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, who visited Kyiv on Tuesday and said the attacks called into doubt Russia's seriousness about peace. Analysts predicted that little progress would be made this week in Abu Dhabi. I didn't have high expectations for this round of negotiations, especially after the very controversial situation around the so-called energy ceasefire, said Volodymyr Fesenko, a leading Ukrainian political analyst. I think this round was purely an interim one. It's collective punishment. Iran exacts heavy price on protest supporters. The authorities are making mass arrests, seizing assets, and hunting down doctors who treated protesters. Some Iranians keep showing defiance anyway. By Erica Solomon, Layli Nikunazer, and Sanam Mohouzi. The protests are largely over in Iran, crushed by the heavy hand of the government, but the retribution is just beginning. Doctors who treated injured protesters have been swept up in mass arrests, beloved businesses have been seized and shuttered, and critical media has been silenced, all to stamp out the possibility of further unrest. Even families holding funerals for loved ones killed during the crackdown have been ordered not to cry in public. Several rights groups estimate that up to 40,000 people have been detained since protests began, many on charges of being rioters or terrorists. Many have made televised confessions that rights groups say are likely forced. Activists say the scope and scale of the repression tactics are perhaps the most sweeping in the Islamic Republic's history. It's collective punishment, said Mahmoud Amiri Moghadam, the director of Iran Human Rights, an Oslo-based organization. They want to traumatize a whole generation so they won't rise up again. The severity of the crackdown reflects how much Iran's clerical leaders feel they have their backs to the wall, analysts say. In addition to an ever-deepening economic crisis, which set off protests in late December that snowballed into a nationwide movement, the government also has to reckon with the possibility of a U.S. attack. The government is signaling that it is prepared to do whatever it takes to remain in power, said Omid Memarian, a senior Iran analyst at Dawn, a Washington-based organization focused on the Middle East. Since quelling the protests, the Iranian government has publicly acknowledged the death of around 3,000 people in the crackdown, though rights groups estimate the final toll will be far higher. Weeks after those killings, protesters are still being rounded up, and so are the medics who cared for them. The New York Times spoke to 3 doctors in Iran who shared the names of at least 11 colleagues arrested in the past week. Among them, doctors, nurses, and dentists. They said their colleagues had been detained for treating protesters in the secrecy of their own homes. The whereabouts of one doctor remains unknown. Like all of those interviewed inside Iran for this story, the doctors requested anonymity out of fear of retribution. 2 of them said they had been repeatedly summoned for questioning by officials seeking more information about those who helped protesters. Even household names in Iran have not been spared arrest, among them Mohammed Seydinia, a gray-mustachioed owner of a national cafe chain. Mr. Seydinia's coffee shops offered Iranians a taste of a world closed off to them by clerical rulers and punishing international sanctions, serving international crazes like cruffins and cold brew. But on January 8th, the Seydinia cafes joined businesses around the country that showed support for the demonstrations by going on strike. Days after the deadly crackdown, the authorities sealed the doors of Seydinia cafes around the country and left a notice that they would remain closed for 2 months, according to one employee. Mr. Seydinia, his son, Sadegh, who ran the cafes, and a store manager were arrested, the employee said. A spokesman for Iran's judiciary, Asghar Jahangir, confirmed Mr. Seydinia's arrest on Tuesday, saying that the cafe owner had supported the rioters and that if convicted, his assets would be used to pay for damages caused during the unrest. The closure of Mr. Seydinia's business was symbolic for many Iranians who see the state's targeting of cultural symbols as a bid to demoralize its opponents. When Iran's prosecutor general, Mohammad Movadehi Azad, ordered the judiciary to identify and seize the assets of famous people who supported the protests, he said it was to take action against terrorists and their backers in a way that teaches a lesson. In mid-January, prosecutors in Tehran told state media that they had opened cases against 15 athletes and actors, as well as 10 other people who signed a statement from Iran's largest filmmakers guild declaring that they stand with the oppressed people of Iran. An Iranian government spokesman did not respond to a request for comment about the crackdown measures. The Iranian authorities are silencing even those voices that consider themselves reformists, not opponents of the system, like the newspaper Ham Mehan. It was shut down on January 19th. Ham Mehan was one of the few publications inside Iran to cover the protests and the heavy injuries and deaths. A subsequent opinion piece by the paper's editor, Mohammad Javad Ruh, said that Iran's current leadership, like the Shah before his ousting in 1979, had become indecisive and unable to find a way out of a compounding crisis. This is why people feel they have no future, Mr. Roux said in an interview. They see that in practice there is no functioning state in Iran. Mr. Roux said Ham Mahan was the first news outlet to be shut down since 2016, and that the paper has not been given a court date to contest. The repression touches even the bereaved, with the authorities regularly monitoring and banning funerals of those slain during the protests. One Iranian, Abbas, said that he and his relatives were repeatedly summoned as they organized a ceremony for 3 family members shot to death during the protests in a city north of Tehran. The authorities forced them to sign pledges of silence, he said. They made us sign commitments not to cry, not to leave the door of the house that hosts the memorial ceremony open, said Abbas, who did not want his relationship to the family publicized. While the government appears to have largely suppressed the protests, Mr. Mamarian, the think tank analyst, warned of a dam that could suddenly crack. It may harden public resolve, making the government more vulnerable if protests continue rather than less, he said. Some Iranians are daring to voice defiance. Last week, 17 prominent civil society leaders, filmmakers, lawyers, and rights activists released a new statement blaming Iran's supreme leader for a crackdown they called an organized state crime against humanity. Several of the signatories were arrested, among them Mehdi Mahmoodian, a screenwriter for the movie It Was Just an Accident, which has been nominated for 2 Oscars this year. On Tuesday, students at 31 medical, nursing, and dental schools across the country boycotted their exams or held sit-ins to protest the deaths of fellow students in the crackdown and the continuing arrests of medics. Mourners, too, have found a way to fight back, with celebration instead of tears. In recent days, videos posted on social media have shown mourners playing music and throwing confetti, more in keeping with a wedding ceremony than a funeral. In one video verified by The Times, family members can be seen dancing as they sing along to a local folk song. The heart was no longer tight with longing, they sing. Suddenly it went mad. It became war. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The Parade of Nations is an Olympic highlight. Italy says, let's have 4. Because the 2026 Winter Olympics are so spread out, athletes will march in Milan and several other locations. By Victor Mather. At the Winter Olympics opening ceremonies on Friday, athletes will march in the traditional Parade of Nations at the San Siro Stadium in Milan. But they will also be parading elsewhere in Italy, in Cortina d'Ampezzo, Predazzo, and Livigno. This geographically expansive Olympics will be just as spread out for the opening festivities. Milan is the first named host of the Milan Cortina Winter Games, but while the city has the facilities to host indoor events like figure skating and ice hockey, it has a conspicuous absence of high mountains. That brings in Cortina d'Ampezzo in the Italian Dolomites, 150 miles to the northeast, where skiers will head down the slopes, lugers will glide, and biathletes will ski and shoot. Both places will have Olympic cauldrons that will be lit during the opening ceremonies, but not all the events will be held in those 2 regions. Livigno and Bormio, both over 100 miles from Milan by car in the Italian Alps, will host snowboarding and the new Olympic sport of ski mountaineering. Predazzo and Tessero, roughly 125 miles away, will host ski jumping and cross-country skiing. The issue is not just geography, it's the facilities. The organizers were eager not to sink into a financial morass by building numerous new arenas and tracks, instead mostly reusing existing venues. And there just are not luge tracks in every town. The Olympic organizers say this is the first time the opening ceremony will be divided across 4 cities. The main ceremony will take place in the San Siro, the largest stadium in Italy. It is home of the soccer giants Inter Milan and AC Milan, and is celebrating its 100th birthday this year. A highlight of any Olympics is the Parade of Nations, as athletes, coaches, and officials in uniform march into the main stadium behind their country's flag. This time, though, it will be the Parades of Nations. Athletes will parade in the city center of Cortina d'Ampezzo, at the ski jumping stadium in Predazzo, and at the snowboard and freestyle skiing site in Lavigno. Though the bulk of the performances and pomp will be at the San Siro, satellite events and symbolic moments will be held in the other locations, organizers say. Carrying a flag is a high honor often given to athletic superstars and national heroes. At these games, each nation will get 2 flag bearers who can share flag-carrying duties at the same location or be at 2 different locations. Italy, as host, will get 4 flag carriers. Why 4 parades? Most of the competitors are staying in or near the places they will compete, and quite a few will be starting their events on Saturday and Sunday. Asking them to haul to Milan and back seems too much. And after all the skating, skiing, and curling is done, the closing ceremony will be held in yet another city in northern Italy, Verona, in order to take advantage of its 2,000-year-old amphitheater. Who is that masked man? The orchids aren't telling. Mr. Flower Fantastic, guest designer for the New York Botanical Gardens Orchid Show, lets his art speak for itself, never showing his face. By Laurel Graber. The guest designer of the New York Botanical Gardens 2026 Orchid Show spent his boyhood wanting to become Batman. Now he aspires to be a different superhero, Mr. Flower Fantastic. I guess my focus is about saving nature, he said, which ultimately I think saves people. Mr. Flower Fantastic, it's his nom de plume, spoke with me last week in the garden's Enid A. Haupt Conservatory, a steamy, sunny refuge from the Bronx's surrounding Arctic air. He and a team were installing the Orchid Show, Mr. Flower Fantastic's concrete jungle, an urban landscape overrun by wild delights. Opening on Saturday and running through April 26th, the exhibition reflects the 2 Jamaicas that have influenced its designer, Jamaica, Queens, where he grew up, and Jamaica, the island, his mother's ancestral home. Inside, familiar New York structures sport tropical twists. Instead of ivy, lush layers of pink, white, and fuchsia phalaenopsis, the common but extremely varied moth orchid, cascade down a brownstone facade. A dumpster crammed with trash bags also overflows with blossoms. Mock subway stops, Orchid Avenue and Desert Avenue, appear as well as flower-filled newsstand where visitors can pick up instructions on orchid care. There's a sort of uncanny way that he enlivens the objects that we surround ourselves with, said Joanna Grorka, the garden's vice president for exhibitions and programming. The things we collect, like sneakers, or the things we see every day, like a hydrant, a fire hydrant that's been opened up to cool off in the summertime, and he's got this really creative way of bringing those to life using flowers. MFF, as he likes to be called, has created city scenes that are recognizable and yet, like him, unidentifiable. He preserves his anonymity with a respirator mask that also keeps his beloved medium from aggravating his severe pollen allergy. Anonymity is honestly the most authentic way to share my work, he said, and to share it with an open heart, freely, without being criticized for being anyone I am or anyone I'm not. Over the past 8 years, MFF has certainly become someone. A self-taught artist, he began leaving his floral work, the medium that makes him most happy despite his allergy, around the city in the anonymous style of Keith Haring. Recalling being beaten by local toughs as a boy in his mother's garden, he chose a subject that he thought would appeal even to bullies: sneakers. His Instagram posts attracted Serena Williams' team, who asked him to honor her at the 2018 U.S. Open by recreating the Nike shoe that Virgil Abloh designed for her. The masked MFF presented Williams with that floral sculpture, a moment that led to developing art for brands like Nike, Adidas, Puma, and Louis Vuitton, as well as a commissioned piece for the 2023-24 exhibition Spike Lee Creative Sources at the Brooklyn Museum. "I don't know if this is a therapy session or not," he said of his 23rd annual Orchid Show, his first large solo. But the exhibition, which features thousands of living orchids rather than cut specimens, reveals more of himself than ever before. "This show is a journey into the parts of me that were seeds and started to grow." Concrete Jungle features New York haunts like a pizza joint, its roof decorated with whimsical scenes in synthetic plant material. The exhibition also has a laundromat, where instead of swirling clothes, the mock machines reveal interior arrays of less common orchids, like the Oncidium, including dancing lady orchids, the Zygonesia, such as snowbird orchids, and the miniature Cattleya. Nearby, a floralized car wash evokes MFF's childhood memories. "The car wash for me was like a portal that I transported through," he said. The design includes a sculpted New York City yellow cab surrounded by orchid plants that recalls Taxi, a 2024 work he created for the Queen's Botanical Garden. Because of the demands of both installations, MFF used synthetic blossoms, carnations his favorite flower, to cover the cab's molded chassis. Taxi definitely got us on the radar of some different audiences. Regina Forlenza, the assistant director of visitor services at the Queen's Garden, said in a phone interview, "It drew a lot of the younger demographic." The New York Botanical Garden is aiming for the same effect with programs that include Q&A sessions, sensory stations, and, starting in March, Orchid Nights, a snack and cocktail series with DJ April Hunt. "There's a different kind of relatability to my audience because I really get to experience this with them too," said MFF, who selected the show's dozens of orchid varieties with Brian Sullivan, the garden's vice president for glasshouses and landscape. "I don't consider myself an expert. Rather," he added, "I'm just a kid from Queens who found my community, found my voice, and is an advocate for nature. And I get to do it with a little bit of superhero flair." You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Friday, February 6th issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Chris Wilhelm. Thank you for listening.